What is good, everybody? Welcome back to another episode brought to you by the League FFB. Today, I wanted to come to you guys with my top buys in Dynasty right now. Players that I am actively targeting in leagues that I play in that I think are going to have bounce back seasons in 2025. So without wasting any more time, let's hop right into today's video and let's start talking about these buys. All right, so the first player that I want to talk about in today's video is going to be Breece Hall, running back for the New York Jets. Now, Breece is coming off of a 2024 season where he had 209 rushing attempts for 876 rushing yards. In the air, he had 57 receptions for 483 yards and 8 total touchdowns. Now, this production was good for 15.1 fantasy points per game, which was 16th best at the position for running backs this year. And Breece Hall and interim head coach Jeff Ulbrich mentioned that Breece was struggling a bit this year with some knee pain that he had earlier in the season. I think that may have affected his overall performance despite the fact that he didn't really miss too much time here in 2024. Now, that considered, he was 12th overall in weighted opportunities with 76 targets, which would have put him at 3rd amongst all running backs in targets, and he was 1st in routes run with a total of 423 routes run and an average of 26.4 per game, which proves that he's still a major PPR threat. Plus, I still think he showed some promising efficiency metrics. He posted top 15 numbers in breakaway runs, yards created, and evaded tackles, but unfortunately nearly a fourth of Breece Hall's runs were stuffed at or before the line of scrimmage, which is more of a result of poor offensive line play failing to stop the initial push of that defensive line. Now, it is worth noting, as we're talking about offensive lines, both Tyron Smith, his left tackle, and Morgan Moses, his right tackle, are unrestricted free agents this offseason, and Tyron Smith ended the year with the best run blocking win rate of any tackle before his injury, so he will be a huge piece for them to bring back due to him being really the only strong run blocker on that offensive line that ranked bottom 10 last season. So yes, overall it was a down year from Breece Hall, but I do think that the underlying metric and some of the context to the year as a whole do paint a clearer picture as to why Breece did have a down season and why you may be potentially getting a dip or a discount on a very elite running back here in trade markets this offseason, especially if new head coach Aaron Glenn decides to establish the run the same way that they used to do in Detroit when he was there. Now, moving on to my second buy here, I want to talk about Jaylen Waddle, the wide receiver for the Miami Dolphins. And just like Breece, he had a very down year in 2024 as well. You're kind of going to see a theme here amongst these players. 83 targets, 58 receptions, 744 receiving yards, and 2 touchdowns for Jaylen Waddle. That all resulted in only 10 fantasy points per game, which would have put him as wide receiver 49 from that fantasy points per game perspective. Now, while 2024 was certainly a down year for Jaylen Waddle and the Miami Dolphins as a whole, it's really hard for me to pin anything on Waddle as far as poor play is concerned. He did deal with a few nagging leg injuries that did knock him out of a few games this year, but the majority of the reason as to why he didn't produce, to me at least, is because of Tua Tagovailoa's health. Now, when you look at the season and the production of Jaylen Waddle in games where both he and Tua Tagovailoa were both healthy, the splits are drastic. Jaylen Waddle averaged 7 fantasy points per game in games with Tua Tagovailoa off the field and 13.4 fantasy points per game in games with Tua Tagovailoa on the field. And while 13.4 fantasy points per game would have still been one of his worst seasons to date from a fantasy points per game perspective, it would have only put him about a point behind his 2023 season where he was the wide receiver 21 from a fantasy points per game perspective. Now, this in itself is a very promising statistic that I do think helps us gain some clarity about that messy Dolphins situation in 2024, and it is worth noting that there is certainly still risk in Tua Tagovailoa as his concussion history isn't necessarily going to go away. But you can look at this and know that Jaylen Waddle is still a wide receiver 2 when his quarterback is healthy, and he's currently being valued much lower than that. Not to mention that we've also heard Tyreek say that he wants to potentially leave Miami and go play elsewhere, leaving Jaylen Waddle as the best wide receiver option in Miami, especially after he just signed a large extension just one offseason ago that's going to keep him around until 2028. And like I said, even though there is still risk in Tua Tagovailoa, I think the underlying metrics, the data do support that this year, 2024, was more so an outlier year for Jaylen Waddle when you look at that whole career sample size. And I think we definitely have a probable chance for Jaylen Waddle to bounce back here in 2025. Let's move on to my third buy. I want to talk about Rome Odunze, wide receiver for the Chicago Bears. And obviously Rome came in as a rookie in that 2024 draft class. He played in 17 games, had 101 targets for 54 receptions, only 734 receiving yards, and 3 touchdowns. Now, all of this resulted in 8.5 fantasy points per game, which was good for the wide receiver 53. Obviously not what you felt you drafted Rome Odunze to do on those Dynasty fantasy football rosters. And while nothing went well for the Chicago Bears on offense this year, and as a result, I think nothing really went well for their elite rookie wide receiver either, I'm looking at some of these underlying metrics, and I definitely see some room for growth from Rome Odunze. Now, he did start off the year with a sprained MCL, and he did choose to play through that, so I have to wonder if that did affect some of the early season production. But the other part of this is Odunze was used very poorly for the majority of the year. Now, he saw fewer snaps as the primary X receiver for the Bears than DJ Moore, even though that's kind of what Odunze's best position is, and he was moved all around the football field from the slot to the backfield and everywhere in between, all despite his natural best ability to win at that X wide receiver position. Now, Odunze did see some very promising success rates this year. They showed that he can win against all forms of defensive coverage, and he was targeted in the red zone at a top 12 rate in the NFL, showing that when Caleb Williams gets within scoring distance for the Bears, he does rely on Rome to go make that play. Not to mention that there should also be some added opportunities coming Rome Odunze's way here later this year, because Keenan Allen, the veteran wide receiver for the Bears, is scheduled to be an unrestricted free agent, and it does feel more than likely that he does end up taking money to go elsewhere. Now, the Ben Johnson hire in Chicago gives me a ton of hope for Rome, as Ben has been credited for getting the best out of most of his players during his time that he spent there in Detroit, and I could very well see a very similar year 2 from Rome Odunze that we saw in a similar wide receiver that was disappointing during his rookie year in Jackson Smith-Njigba. I think the similarities between the two are very eerily similar, even down to Shane Waldron being the offensive coordinator for them at the start of their rookie years. But these are two rookies that were on very talented depth charts that ended up finding some opportunities and ultimately could break out, or did break out, in year 2. So I think Rome Odunze is definitely a player I'm targeting buying, and maybe one of my favorite buys in this episode. Now, keeping it themed around some of the rookies, I have another rookie that I'm buying currently. It's going to be JJ McCarthy, quarterback for the Minnesota Vikings. And after being picked in the top 10 of the 2024 NFL draft, JJ McCarthy would miss the entirety of his rookie season due to a torn meniscus that he suffered in his first preseason game. So we don't really have any data to go off of for year 1, as JJ McCarthy just didn't play at all. Now, McCarthy did show flashes of his potential in that game, but he did end up watching Sam Darnold under center for the Vikings for the entirety of the remaining season. They would go on to win 14 games, and Darnold would finish as the QB 11 in fantasy points per game. And while this buy for JJ McCarthy is certainly more speculative than others, I do think we have a good enough sample size with Vikings head coach Kevin O'Connell to know that this offense is very fantasy friendly for quarterbacks with high volume passing attempts, resulting in lots of passing yards and passing touchdowns. Everybody knows it at this point, but Sam Darnold, he is a free agent in 2025, and while many people are going to debate whether or not Sam Darnold should come back to Minnesota or should he chase the bag to go elsewhere, there could even be the chance that he gets franchise tagged by Minnesota. I don't think any of that really matters in the long run. The Vikings have selected JJ McCarthy to be the franchise quarterback, and whether it is in 2025 or 2026 if Darnold comes back on the tag, McCarthy will get his shot as the Vikings focus on building the roster around a rookie contract at the quarterback position. McCarthy is only 22 years old, and there's a lot of value insulation that is bound to happen with his dynasty stock over the next year or two, especially if we catch wind of him being announced as the starter. So that said, I am buying him now where I can get him for those low-end QB2 prices, where I am seeing that kind of being the value for him universally, with the idea that his value is almost certain to increase over the next 12 to 16 months, whether or not you actually even believe in his on-the-field abilities. And now my last and final buy of this episode, I am going to talk about Travis Etienne for the Jacksonville Jaguars. Now, Etienne's coming off of a 2024 season where he played in 15 games. He had 150 rushing attempts for 558 yards, 39 receptions for 254 receiving yards, and 2 touchdowns. Now, this was his worst season to date. It only averaged 8.7 fantasy points per game, which was the 37th best at the running back position. And the main concern with Travis Etienne is the fact that he saw his total snap share drop from 73.4% in 2023 to a total snap share of 47.8% in 2024 after suffering a week 6 hamstring strain that forced him to miss a few games, and during that absence, an emergence of Tank Bigsby in that Doug Peterson offense. Now, the good news is that Doug Peterson is no longer in the building, and they have hired former Bucs offensive coordinator Liam Cohen as the head coach, who did show us that he can run a very friendly running back scheme in Tampa Bay with running backs in Bucky Irving and Rachaad White. Now, the difference in play style between both Etienne and Bigsby is very obvious. Etienne is the better receiving / pass catching back, and Bigsby is the better goal line back. I kind of view this somewhat like a discounted version of the Montgomery and Gibbs backfield, with obviously a much worse offensive line and not as talented of players, but the overall style of play is somewhat similar. However, I say that to try and prove a point of Etienne potentially being the friendlier fantasy football role under Liam Cohen here in this offense this season. That said, run blocking isn't the strongest part of this this offensive line skill set, and they are going to have to go find some replacements for Cam Robinson, who they did trade away in the regular season, and for Brandon Scherff potentially, who is scheduled to be a free agent this offseason, but there's definitely some room for improvement from a run blocking standpoint here in Jacksonville. So although Travis Etienne was a player that I was definitely high on coming into the 2024 season, and he definitely did disappoint, there is no doubt about it, I do believe that there is a point that we should be buying the dip on Travis Etienne, a former first-round running back who has shown us history of being a producer at the NFL level. So there you have it, folks. There are 5 players that I am actively going out trying to trade for, trying to buy in my Dynasty Fantasy Football leagues. If you did enjoy today's video, make sure you go hit that like button for me. It is the best free way to show this channel some support. And also, while you're down there, make sure you hit the subscribe button. We're trying to get to 5,000 subscribers before the NFL draft. So hopefully, if you're not subscribed, you can help us hit that milestone. And last but not least, make sure you go join our Discord. We do have a free Discord linked in the description, helping you guys with your Dynasty Fantasy Football teams 24/7, 365. But with all of that out of the way, I have nothing else for you guys today. So I will see you on our next episode. But until then, peace out.